Wanda. I'm the director of the Vancouver Arts Colloquium Society. It's a delight to welcome everyone. On behalf of all of us at the documentary team, I want to say to you that we are very excited to be with you tonight because this intergenerational co-creation is something that has been very near and dear to us. And this film only exists because of so many talented, dedicated people from all walks of life involved, including these my team members standing right here and over there, with whom I had the pleasure of collaborating and bonding with last summer and beyond. And also, I want you to know that tonight, we are not looking back on this is what we did, but rather, this is what we started with, and this is where we think we are going. So it's really we're coming to you in the process. So we are co-creating together. I'd like to begin with my prayer to all our ancestors, and I respectfully acknowledge that we are on the unceded ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people. It is my privilege to be here. To be transparent, I have never been trained as a filmmaker. I was formerly trained as a researcher in cancer epidemiology in public health. My current nonprofit work focuses on creating art-based community development because I see the arts as an accessible and effective tool for helping community health and community life flourish. Now to this film. Ideally, filmmakers hope their art speak for itself. However, in this case, a director's statement may help to prime audiences for this type of film. This film interweaves ideas. One idea or one objective which I had in mind was to articulate how we might embrace a concept of human transcendence anchored in nature that may be critical for what we as an individual, as well as what our planet currently needs. But more importantly, parts of this film exist off the screen in the mind of viewers, which is what you bring to the experience. So in order to maximize or optimize that part of the experience, I ask you, before the project starts, to ponder specifically what it would mean if water had a spirit, or if you can accept it, what it means that water has a spirit. I was born and raised in Japan. There, when we see a beautiful waterfall, or beautiful rock, or large tree, our impulse is to make a little shrine or ornament for that spirit that lives in it. By creating such a shrine in a loving, spontaneous way, people spread their appreciation for the waterfalls or trees or whatever nature gifted us. Still today, Japanese spirituality is deeply rooted in this kind of animism, the concept that everything, living or non-living, has a soul or spirit. So in the opening scene, you will see at a tiny shrine adjacent to the water source, which is actually come from my hometown, Kumamoto City, which is very famous for pure groundwater. By the way, Kumamoto City is the only city in Japan which supplies 100% of tap water with groundwater for its 740,000 residents, which is slightly more than that of Vancouver. This is extremely rare in the world. See how I'm proud I am. But anyhow, when you see that scene, you might feel, wow, this place is really alive and treated with solemn respect. And just imagine what kinds of water stewardship takes place there. It's undoubtedly sustainable, although nothing is guaranteed because our natural reserves are limited. So when I heard from Coast Salish elders that water has a spirit, it was not a foreign concept to me. So I became curious about indigenous science and reached out to them to have a conversation. That's how we started this film. Unfortunately, for most urban people, including myself, when we gaze at the waterfall, we nothing but see water falling. We are unable to feel the interconnectedness of all things, leading to a feeling that life is mechanical. But what if we are reanimated with nature or spirit of the natural object? What's possible then? Hold that thought. And lastly, I'd like to point out that water crisis around the globe has intensified lately, as we know. It's been too much or not enough. We do need an urgent action. I will stop right here, and I want to enjoy the film. So sit back and enjoy, and thank you so much. And Johnny?
How is it that we come to know what we are? How is the knowledge being passed on? More than that, what is it that we want to pass on? These are recurrent questions that every generation inevitably has to face. In early 2022, geoscientists in France have developed a new model that shows an almost unlimited source of water stored deep within the mantle of the Earth. At the ocean subduction zone, rock-bound water that is, water in nascent form is transported deep into the Earth's interior. This subduction zone has existed now for 2 to 3 billion years. Meanwhile, with increasing temperature and pressure, the melting and subducting rock releases the water within the mantle. When these hot hydrous melts become buoyant, they seep up toward the crust at the seafloor. This is what scientists call mantle rain, and this is thought to control the volume of the oceans and the rest of the water cycle. Think about this for a moment. What does this discovery mean for all life on Earth? Water is connected and connects everything. As our elders say, water has a spirit. What then does mantle rain mean to each one of us? We feel the urge and immense importance to humanize the deep water that is currently emerging into being. What would it look like and feel like? What if the deep and invisible water existed within us or between us? What's emerging? What's possible? Here, we attempt to understand human flourishing and life transcending in a way of engaging, consuming, and honoring our memory, adversity, and even death. Fresh water exists invisibly deep below the surface as groundwater. Fresh water is a limited resource. Because of this, our ancestors took part in traditions to replenish and preserve it. In this increasingly hostile climate, are we thriving or barely surviving?
first time, for example, that there was over a 40 degrees Celsius or 104 degree Fahrenheit temperature observed in the United Kingdom. There were also all-time records shattered across France, Germany, Portugal, Denmark, and other countries in Europe too.
34% of the Midwest is abnormally dry or experiencing drought. 70% of the West is in a moderate drought, and 98% of California is in severe drought.
Practices that ignore indigenous wisdom have brought us nothing but chaos, despair, and alienation from each other and our environment. As a Northwest Coast Gixon artist, Michael Blackstock aptly puts it, a Western system to model and rationalize bad behavior, where now is always now and is advertised as better than before, and further ignores indigenous wisdom to a fault.
I have a very analytical side to me, but then I decided to do my master's in First Nation studies to and learn about my heritage. And because my dad because he faced so much racism, he really didn't want to talk about it that much. So at first he wasn't open to discussing because of all the racism that he faced. So I had to learn on my own, and then he got used to the idea, and then it kind of went from there. But so doing my master's in First Nation studies, I had to pick a thesis topic, and my uncle Walter, who's from the Gitxsan Nation, he's a master carver. And I was kind of hanging out with him because I do art, like I was learning art from him, and he was showing me this picture of a tree carving that was on his territory, and I thought, oh wow, how come I never heard of these? I'm a forester, I'm an artist, I never heard of this art form where they carve faces on living trees. I thought, well, that'd be a super cool thesis topic. So I went to wrote up a proposal, and the university at first denied approval. They said, well, these things don't exist, so we don't want you to waste your time researching it. Well, I saw a picture of one, my uncle's territory, and so I was kind of persistent there. And it was kind of the first time where I realized that the Western world didn't really have eyes to see everything. You know, I knew these things existed, but the university was saying they didn't. I was like, well, they do.
As I went through the American educational system was when the teachers said, well, who discovered America? And being Native American, I have a particular understanding of who discovered America. And when Columbus was the name that was brought forward, then I said, well, okay, something's wrong with this picture. There's a serious blind spot. And so as a youngster, I already knew at that point that I'm going to have to be dealing with these kinds of blind spots as I move through the education system.
So it is what I call ceremonial reconciliation, which means, on National Indigenous Day, there's the companies and the mining companies and the forest companies have a ceremony and acknowledge the Indigenous people, which is all great, but it doesn't change anything. If you put up Indigenous art in the lobby of your headquarters, it doesn't really change the things that really matter to Indigenous people. So I differentiate ceremonial reconciliation with true reconciliation. And an example of true reconciliation for me is that Western science would say be humble enough to, for example, acknowledge that water has a spirit. It's not going to drastically undermine all of science. It's actually, I think, going to improve it, but it'll be a hard step for scientists to make that. And the other one, like we talk about the moon, like I'm suggesting that Western science should probably put the moon on the water cycle to have balance. Like it's got the sun on there, but it's only sunny half the day. What happens to the water the rest of in the nighttime? So that takes humility, and that's where true reconciliation will happen, is when Western world is actually humble enough to make changes to their system based on to improve it based on suggestions and knowledge from the Indigenous world. We're not there yet.
Others also recognize these blind spots.
There are features of the modern world that are autocratic. They're right there in the center of things. So it's a kind of, it's not that it's not that we have been rational. We had to go that way too, but it's that we become too denying of things that are not completely rational. Now, it's not completely rational that a person has feelings of warmth toward another person. It's not really rational. You don't arrive at that by being rational, I don't think. Or a narrow rationalism that is. So there is a sense in which the present world is pretty far away from the collective wisdom of humanity.
My parents weren't there they didn't come there as settlers. They were there originally before that. And we went through the Mau Mau. I don't know if you ever heard of that, but that was a horrible thing that happened in Africa. You know, the British, the French, the Belgians, they all went to Africa and took over and took the lands. And it's the same here in Canada, you know, put them in schools and change their language or not allow them to speak. And it happened in Africa too.
West Virginia was a remote area. There were no major highways through there. There were just small country roads. And the people liked it that way because the isolation gave them a sense of freedom. They could think what they wanted to, believe what they wanted to, and pretty much do what they wanted to. But this gave me a perspective on the world that I then entered when I was in my late teens, when I started to do a lot of travel. And so I confronted what we called modernism quite late in my life. I grew up in a community that wasn't that different from the old country, whichever old country it was. And that's been important to me because I went through modernism. I studied in the university and graduate school and all that. And I realized that I was fortunate to have had another life experience than modernism. Modernism has given us some of the problems we have with our world today because it puts a high value on rationality and reductionist science and rationality, and this denies pretty point blank a lot of the fundamental things that people have always thought always mean 2 million years. And since the 1700s in the Western world, we've turned our back on all of that, regarded it as superstitious and not scientific. But we threw out the baby with the bath, basically, because those ideas and beliefs had developed over the millennia, and they reflected people's gradual experience of what it means to be alive and to be in community with other people and to be ethical.
I have a feeling that we're more reliant on the technology. We're missing stuff. We no longer navigate by the stars. How many people can spell? Who can do math in their head? You know, we've externalized all of this. And I think what you're saying about your elders is something that, like what in land-based learning, where schools are doing land-based learning, kids are learning to use their body and their experience to learn science and math. And that's an embodied learning, right? Whereas what I did when I was studying plant science was memorizing. And, you know, we all know that when you do something, you have many ways to access that information again, rather than just through your mind. But
Yes.
I mean, when we look at, like you're saying, architecture, and we look at mathematics, and we look at navigation, all of these things that were part of how we survived and essential pieces, then, you know, I don't know. I really wonder about our future.
The kernel of the idea came from John Russell, who's a Langara College instructor, but he's also a globally significant philosopher. But he's the world's leading philosopher of sport. He's co-written Canada's premier biomedical ethics textbook, and is a regular contributor to the world of academic philosophy. And it was his idea that, and I think it's wonderful that this came from a philosopher, that preparing our students to think as philosophers think and geographers think and sociologists and historians and all these other social science and humanities disciplines, training people to think is one thing, but giving them the skills to be able to take those thoughts and apply them in a real world context is an entirely different endeavor. And shame on the social sciences and humanities. We have been profoundly poor all over the world, all through our disciplines, at training people, except in the places where there are very practical jobs that one could go get.
But a Jungian analyst affected me by some talks he gave, because he said that we should try to give ourselves over to the possibility that the earth that we know may not be here forever. That's something that should start to work itself around in our mind. And I adhere to that, although I'm still more optimistic as a person, but I need this realistic perspective that we're at a really dangerous point of degradation.
Recently, scientists have found unsafe levels of PFAS in rainwater everywhere on the planet. PFAS are a hazardous human-made chemical which never breaks down in the environment. What does this mean to life? These troubled waters are analogous to the symptoms of collective trauma and its consequences: emotional numbness, passing through generations. There is no safe space to escape from them.
Like, I was in a British international school, so the classroom was very, very Western dominated. And we would always, like, even history classes and geography classes, we would learn about World War and all these social issues from more the Western perspective. And I remember one time I was talking about the colonial history of Korea as a way to explain the ongoing tension today between Korea and Japan. But some students called me dramatic for that, and then I started actually crying because I was embarrassed, because the whole classroom was filled with like they were kind of like, oh, Yunji got burned, and then when I started crying, it was silenced, right? And I was the only Korean kid in the class, and I think that kind of made me realize how, like, wow, like, I felt so unheard. I felt like I couldn't really talk about my stories and like my history. And that kind of traumatized me in some sense, that like I didn't really feel comfortable talking about my stories or just like about Korea.
So we affect each other in ways we don't know. There are some, in graduate school, some cruel things, because I was the one ethnically different in this particular graduate school. There's some cruel things were said and done, and they're a part of me. I remember them. So one has to be careful in life. We think we don't see the invisible consequences of what it is we do.
In the West, we had started with ideas that there was good and bad. It was up and down. It was so forth, with a binary perspective. And I feel we're still in that perspective today as a whole. Yeah. We still think some people are good and some people think the right thing, and some people are bad and some people think the wrong thing, and we're the good ones and they're the bad ones. Yeah. And Jung would call that the projection of the shadow, because he would say that we all have a mixture of human traits in us, light and dark. And only when I can accept that I have the dark in me, really know that, firsthand experience, then only then can I be less likely to project something thought to be negative on another person or another culture.
I hold on to my beliefs with a light grip. Yeah. I formerly was quite religious and held on to those ideas very rigidly. But when those ideas started undermining some of my relationships, when I realized that they were making me ingenuine in some of my relationships, and the ways in which I met and introduced myself to new people and my intentions for what those relationships would be, I found a real disjuncture in that did not jive with who I saw myself as being. I kind of want to warn the world against all of this. I'm of two minds about telling people not to compromise. There are times we absolutely must compromise, and it is the best way forward to compromise. I think we should always question our convictions. And the harder part in that is be willing to change your mind. Which I think is actually the thing that is our greatest impediment in many ways, is that and I honestly think that's social. I think that is the fear of embarrassment, that you have committed yourself to being one thing. Now you have to go out into the world and say, oh, by the way, I wasn't right. I kind of connect back to the sociological theory of Norbert Elias on what it means to be civilized. Part of being civilized is that our fears have gone from the natural things in the world that would kill us, like bears and weather and starvation, to our greatest fear is now social embarrassment. That our performance as a member of the social group is the thing that we are most concentrated on. And I said earlier that I'm really worried for young people today. That's because young people today are constantly putting their thoughts into the world for people to scrutinize, and it makes it very difficult for them to change and become first of all, it makes it very difficult to be themselves, but then it makes it even more difficult to change oneself.
So that's kind of what I mean when I say rigidity or chaos. The chaos, I think, is that the dopamine hits and how we're searching and unable to settle our minds, and rigidity is equally as challenging, because there's no possibility for movement or change. There are little. And I think that's look what's happening, with the convoy, with the anti-maskers, and there's a rigidity there. But if we can get to the basis of understanding what are the unmet needs of these people, they're behaving in this way. How can we see them as we are one, we're all one? And are they being left behind? Have they fallen through the cracks? Not to say that there isn't evil in the world, but often I think those rigid behaviors come from a point of hurt, and to try and mask it doesn't free us up as a culture. It just pushes it underground, and then it pops up over here.
As Daphne points out, rigid behavior comes from the point of hurt, calling for softening of our hardened hearts. The heart won't be revived through logic or rational thinking. The loss of a soft heart is tragic, as it is our caring that makes us fully human and most humane. The question is, How can we keep our hearts soft amidst the fragmented landscape, severe drought, and dying forest? What we are after is the extraordinary capacities we possess for crafting a life that is worth living, not just for ourselves, but also for future generations. The Japanese poet Kobayashi Issa once wrote, "The world of dew. A world of dew it is indeed, and yet. This is Issa's most famous haiku, written 1 month after the passing of his daughter. As Guy Newland explains in A Buddhist Grief Observed, Issa comments on his poem, "I knew that it was no use to cry, that water once flown past the bridge does not return and scattered blossoms are gone beyond recall. Yet, try as I would, I could not simply cut the binding cord of human love." Issa's expression, "and yet," reminds us of the real message of love. As quiet and fleeting as it may sound, and yet, captured in a dewdrop is a timeless vision of humanity in which fear, isolation, anger, and despair become the wellspring of art rather than an impairment to it. Art, in whatever form, helps us connect with ourselves and the artist even after thousands of years. The spirit of Kobayashi Issa is as rippling as ever.
Over-intellectualizing about life is a dead end, I found. And I think what poetry does for me is that it opens up life. Life is open, and I look for the meaning of things, and I look at connections that I'm not aware of, because I think if you're honest, you realize you know so little. The brain is such a small organ. It can't fit everything in. And that if you're constantly open and learning new things, you appreciate life more. It's the externals are not as important as what's invisible. And the legacy also is that we're influenced by people who lived 1,000 years ago. After my husband died, what comforted me most for a while was poetry. Ancient Chinese poetry, ancient Japanese poetry, ancient Persian poetry, and because they were not, universities had not taught them how to write poetry. They just let life write, and they edited life. And it touched my heart, and I thought, gee, they're no different. They went through the same things, and there was beauty, there was kindness, there was suffering, there was cruelty, and you had to kind of maneuver your way through a lot of the painful things of life.
One of the most important things that I do in terms of my own research and my professional responsibilities is to help revitalize Indigenous languages. And one of the things that I recognize, again, this is one of those blind spots that, we see in disciplines. Often when you read the literature in linguistics about language documentation and revitalization, they have a tendency to focus on the code, the language itself. And so for me, one of the things that I recognize is when I'm with community elders and I'm listening to them use their language, it's poetry, it's music, it's art. It is just so beautiful. And so what really makes it beautiful is not the code itself, it's the relationships. And so for me, one of the things that I'm really interested in is how does my artwork create those kinds of relationships? And so if we can come together and have a conversation about the cartoon or share the experiences about the installation pieces, then we're creating these worlds. And some of the most innovative work that's being done in linguistic anthropology and language revitalization is along the lines of world making. And so we're not documenting the language as much as we're creating new worlds. And so for me, that's what artwork does. It allows us to come together and co-create these new worlds. There are a lot of angry artists out there. And they have good reasons to be angry, and their artwork can evoke that kind of anger. And so I can look at those pieces and I can say, well, okay, yeah, this person's really angry about this or that. And so in some ways, the work assaults you. And so you can't ignore it. And that's the effect that these artists would like to have with their artwork. But for me, does that really create a community of caring? And so for me, I want to create that community of caring. And this is where, if I can create pieces that invite conversation, then the most important cue is that let's work together. Not let's be angry together, but let's work together. And so as Native peoples, we've got a lot to be angry about. For me, what's most important is that we do not forget those particular experiences, but what we need to do is work together moving forward.
Movement forward is the key. In nature, osmosis happens when water molecules brush against the roots of a living plant. Free and effortless, they glide into the root system. It is a simple law of nature. This osmosis occurs in us too. When we well up with emotions, we humans instinctively communicate to others or express our emotion through our art.
I did really love doing the drawing of my aunt, the portrait of my aunt. Mm-hmm. And I also feel a little bit sad that I didn't do another one or make another copy. And honestly, in that one, it was very sensitive. I asked for her permission before doing it.
I see.
I just wanted to be respectful and knowing that the theme that I had chosen from their list was residential school, and she said okay as long as she didn't have to talk about anything, and that was fair. It was just really important for me to really wanted to do that one because that school itself that she had gone to was very difficult, trying times, and I saw it, and I don't know, I had this vision of wanting to do it.
There was a conversation I had with the guy Enrico, who played the guitar while I improvised or spoke my poetry. And one time we were practicing at his home on the porch. It was quiet, and he asked me to tell him about my life. So I recounted some things about my life, and then he replied with his guitar. He improvised, and then that's how we had the conversation. Then I would be inspired by the music, and I would pick something out of my life that that the music brought out, and I would tell him about that, and then he had sympathy on his face, but he never used words. It was music. So I learned that you can communicate in different ways. People don't have to give you what you think you need or want. People can give you what they have, and that may be a benefit, a strength, in that you're open to gifts that you didn't foresee.
So I said, look, well, let's have a Zoom birthday party. I'll invite a bunch of people I know who are singers. They'll sing and entertain, and then we can, family that I haven't seen in ages, or high school friends and all that stuff. I could invite all these people to come watch the performance and hear the stories and so on. So I did all of that. So for that, I wanted to be able to say something about the experience of growing up in that factory town in those days. So I wrote a song. And I was aware that there was a lot of conflict between the union and the management, and then, promises that you would get more pay if you were patient. And of course, that never happened because the factories moved away and so on. So I wanted to write a song that was about that experience, but when I thought about it, I didn't have an explanation for why that had happened beyond the obvious. So I ended up doing it, coming up with the idea of saying, it never happened. Who is to blame? But I'll give you a small sample of that song. When I was a lad, just learning my trade, they told me to wait and that I'd be well paid and feed a large family on my future income. So I waited and waited for that day to come, toiled year after year till my brain it went numb, toiled year after year till my brain it went numb. While the owners and lawyers and bankers and such, they get what they want and they don't leave us much. We played by their rules and stayed in their game. They promised us change, but it never came. Somebody tell me who is to blame. I don't know if anyone else was having a good time, but I was. I was just really surprised by it. So it produced a delight. But I think it's the delight at the creativity. You didn't know it was there. And that parallels what I was saying too about the music, writing songs at the moment. They seem to occur almost spontaneously. I mean, there'll be a seed crystal, there'll be a concept or a musical hook or a chorus, a couplet or a few lines that'll provide a refrain that you write verses around that. But however it starts, it grows, and I've always enjoyed that process.
These unfolding expressions as osmosis move effortlessly between people from one to another in an unimaginable way.
One of the things that I did recognize is that early commitment to drawing and storytelling was a way of reaching people I don't even know. And how do we include people in conversations on a level where they don't even meet me, but they can look at the cartoons or look at the artwork and understand where I'm coming from, what kind of story I'm trying to share with them.
Like some of the learning principles in Indigenous world is learn by doing and learn by story. So, ideally, like I'm starting this Blue Ecology Institute Foundation, and it's going to be focused on youth and sharing blue ecology with youth and as a way to inspire hope, because the youth that I'm talking to they've actually almost given up. Is the climate change is reversible, and they just feel hopeless in the future, and that just makes me incredibly sad. So that blue ecology is a source of hope. But anyways, like more the learning principles are learn by doing, learn through story, learn from your balance of heart and mind and spirit. Like you have to embrace all of those, and through that diagram of spirit, harmony, respect, unity, balance, all those principles need to be at play in learning, not just
including moon.
And the moon, exactly.
Yeah. Colonialism can be really loud, and it can really dominate thinking, and it has dominated our thinking and our imaginations for so long. which is why I think arts is so central to the whole piece and the whole journey, and has been for generations. Because there is a really profound leaning into this other way, this life-giving, life-forming way for all people. I do think there's a lot of reason to hope, and I also understand when people aren't in that place. I was remembering kind of part of my PhD work and hosting some arts-based workshops. Part of what came out there was this sense that art can be scary for a lot of people. So on kind of a micro scale, asking somebody to write a poem when they don't write poetry, they don't think of themselves as an artist, or creating a collage or drawing a picture, but then understanding how the process really pulls them out of themselves and allows them to see these connections being made across difference, across other ideas, how there's synergy in what they made with someone else, and being able to kind of really dive into some of these challenging topics that can be really difficult or scary to talk about, and that are from the dominant system really intentionally not talked about, like race, like oppression, class, these different pieces that we're kind of numbed along the way. And so I think art is a jolting, a startling process that as we're ushered into it in inhospitable spaces and led through that, it can be really a powerful way to see our small creation connecting us into a broader whole, and how that can be that inertia to kind of start that ball moving.
So what this is about is, I don't come from privilege, and at times in my life, like many people, I have had a lot of difficulty, and I've leaned into nature, and I've really been attached to conifers, to trees, and imagined that there was a tree inside me. And then I was flexible. I could move just like a tree would move. I could balance myself. I was rooted, and at times I would just sit and look out the window at trees, and I was that tree, and it was holding me as I struggled. So
what a beautiful imageries.
So that's what, and also cedar trees, like of the sacred medicines, there's cedar, sweetgrass, tobacco, and sage. And so this represents the cedar tree, and represented in different colors, and the braided portion is the sweetgrass.
I'm an artist I'm an academic and an artist, so I feel very comfortable flitting between totally disparate things and trying to see what connects them. And I got to say, my art is all about what connects things. That geography as a discipline is all about not seeing the things, but seeing what connects the things together.
Colin, that your art behind this freeway, I would hear your process, that moment you make a meaning.
I scrubbed this from the TED Talk, but I had actually talked about the sort of the moment of creation in that, in some of the early drafts. It came to me while I was lecturing to my students. I just kept seeing in my mind, because I was using Google Earth images to show students. I do a lecture on movement in an urban context, and the role of cars and the paradoxes that cars present to us. And I would be showing my students freeway infrastructure, talking about it from an infrastructure perspective. But in my mind, I kept sort of seeing the beauty of these shapes. It's a beautiful ugly. I continued along that journey for a while, but the frustration I was feeling was that the only art was in the creation of the connections, where this has changed now. And in fact, even what you're looking at now, it has changed even since then. It's still evolving as a piece. It's too big for me to complete quickly, so it keeps evolving.
You said that you had the lens of seeing things through the connections.
What lies between is the term I like to use. Geographers look at what lies between. And I hope that's the theme that people will take from seeing this is, I hope that they find their, as I said in the talk, I don't want my ideas to be your ideas about this. I want you to find your ideas.
I loved it, in fact, that it really encouraged us to see what emerges out of the invisible. So that.
Thank you. I wish I talked to you before I did the talk. That would have been a nice thing to include.
No.
So I did have experience working with the survivors. I was able to speak to one of them in one of many events that I went to for the Comfort Women movement, and I remember her saying that she felt ashamed and she felt unheard. She felt that this continued stigmatization around sexual violence was kind of like a second rape to her. But despite all that, she was saying that she is going to continue fighting and she's going to continue speaking of her experience because speaking of her experience and just being able to talk about it helped her, and it changed her from a victim to an activist. And I think when she was talking about that, I was just very inspired by that. So the best way for me, in my mind, for me to kind of bring justice to them and make sure their voices are not forgotten was to use the social media account to tell their stories and make sure I'm kind of throwing their stories at people's faces, being like, listen to their story. This is what happened and why it matters. And just trying to keep their voices kind of alive, I guess, in some sense. Fortunately, a lot of them have passed away, but, just because they passed away doesn't mean that the experience is gone, right? Like, it did happen, and is why it's even more important for us to keep listening to their stories and remembering.
Rainwater continues to move downward, seeping into the soil, now filling empty spaces and cracks below the ground. And then it reaches to the water table, the wellspring of life. Nothing is softer or more flexible than water. Yet nothing can resist it, says the ancient Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu. Do you want to experience wholeness rather than being broken into thoughts, concepts, ideas, and beliefs? Deep down, you know your answer.
So how do I get somebody to experience Maliseet worlds? Not to understand it cognitively, but to understand it emotionally. And so this is why the installation piece was so important. And so 3-foot by 7-foot panels, and it reproduced primordial space. It takes place at Squaben, the first light of dawn, not when the sun is appearing over the horizon, but when it starts to glow. And so superimposed on that 360-degree landscape are depictions of each prayer stanza itself. And then I have the text, I have directional marker, and I have a logogram of Tobic First Nation, and I also have a small square traditional, birch bark, etching. And so all of this was used to create that sense of Maliseet space, time, language. And so I had that first draft, as a public presentation. And so during the opening, when this was being viewed, I was watching people walk in and out of the installation piece, and there were a lot of thoughtful looks, and so I was wondering, how are people receiving this? And a colleague of mine from geography, he was in there for the longest time, and then he came out and came up to me and he says, Bernie, when I'm in that space, I feel pure joy. And so for me, that's the goal of the artwork. How do we share that experience and celebrate what we can all share as we imagine possible worlds?
I think poetry is like singing and dancing. I also like to dance. It's a natural expression of joy in life, or poetry also a desire to connect with other people with in a way that is not totally reliant on words. In poetry, you use words a little bit like music. They carry the meaning that's underneath and in between the words, and because language is limited. So I think music, dance, and poetry try to get at what we can't ordinarily express, and to kind of enrich our lives and enrich each other's lives.
Notice how these artists transcend the limits of their minds. We are so much more than just our thoughts or mental identities. Even death is the most natural and normal state of being that is possible.
Human and nature are not separate.
No.
Together is movements together.
Right. The connection, not just between people, but within ourselves and also between nature and humans.
Yeah. Universally, the spiral is a symbol of resilience.
Okay. Oh, I didn't know that.
Double strand gene.
Yes.
The spiral.
The double helix.
Yeah.
How can we identify in ourselves? Like my mother decided to die. She said, "I'm tired. I want to throw in the towel." And so we brought the doctor in, and she said, "Do you want to know how to do this?" And my mother said, "Yes." I'm going to stop sharing this thing. There we are. So she said, "Stop eating and stop drinking, and in 3 weeks or 4, you will die." So that's what my mom did. My mom had been a 45-year practitioner of yoga. And right until the end, I have these phenomenal pictures of my mother in yoga postures and her cane right beside her. But, doing the plow and doing forward bend. She traveled back and forth, Pico. She traveled back and forth between the two worlds. It was like unbelievable. People were drawn to her. And she would leave and she'd come back and she'd say, "I saw Papa, her father." And she said, "I was wrong about him, Daphne. I now see what a good person he was." And she would tell me what he did, how he served the community. She said, "I sat on his knee and he's waiting for me now." And so then she would say things like, she'd say, "Daphne, never forget this. Please always remember, we're all one. I see that we're all one," And another time she said, "Look for the beauty in everything. Just look for the beauty in everything." And she came back, I've got them all written down, but I'm trying about that. We're all one business. I'm really trying to see the world through that light, and particularly the natural world, which we have become so divorced from, right? So I think that's what you're saying is in part.
I have a similar experience with my mom. When 2019, even though I wasn't there at my hometown, but we were able to talk like this through the phone.
Yeah.
And so her life motto was "Give joy to others." And she was always smiling. She was a nurse all her life. And after retire, she connected to her childhood passion, which is always dancing and ballet, Hawaiian dance. And so she danced for everybody throughout. And she was dying from the gastric cancer.
Sorry to hear that.
Yeah, and yet all of us, all of our relatives and families, we got the courage from her because to the last minute, she was calm. She was very so forgiving. It's just
she was at peace,
very peace. And I asked her many times, "Mom, I'm just scared," but then she wasn't. The last minute, she was giving reassurance to everybody, and that's what I want to be. Showing that I think she's connected to, as like your mom, that I don't know, something really mighty things. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that like my mom, like my sister's a yoga teacher, and my mom the Shavasana is the corpse pose in yoga, and it's often done at the end of a series of asanas. And Wendy said, Mom, let's breathe together. Let's just do the Shavasana breathing. And she breathed my mom out. That's how my mom died. She left this world. And so it was very, very beautiful. And like I think what you're saying is probably might be able to be summed up like this. Your mom not only taught you how to live, but she taught you how to die, potentially, right?
Yes, yes.
And that's really a beautiful gift.
The day. On the day you were born, you entered time and were handed a planet. Weren't you lucky? Beauty and danger played chess with each other. They took turns winning. Some wind spirit was assigned to pull you back from precipices, and another to lead you to vistas that continue to feed your wondering heart. So here's the time allotted to us, and the time we allot, the time that can never be taken from us, that remains after we leave. I think as in the poem I read, that here's the time allotted to us, and the time we allot what can never be taken from us after we leave. And I think even if there's no official legacy, if we don't leave anything on a conscious level, I think every life that is lived, including the birds and the dogs and every other creature on this earth, that the world is a little bit different, and that they leave their spirit. I think whatever kind of life you led, you created a certain spirit in the community you were in, and even after you die, the spirit continues. You've affected other people, then they will affect others. There's like nothing lost.
The human spirit, our legacy, is born out of human experiences and continues transcending our minds after we die, circulating just like the water cycle, flowing through the ocean up into the sky and perhaps to the very dense and hot mantle in the deep core. Hito means a human being. The kanji is formed out of two people who support each other. It symbolizes our interdependence as human beings. We are all human spirits full of creativity. Where did this full and yet unrealized potential start in the first place?
You know, when I started first grade, I didn't speak English at all. And so my first language is Maliseet, and I felt really lost and alienated, you know, on that very first day of class. And so one of the things I did recognize is that I was put in a position where everything that I knew to be true and right with the world was rendered meaningless and mute in this new context. And so for me, I think that's where, okay, how do I make that kind of adjustment? And I couldn't do it myself. And so my mother was really important in helping me navigate those early years and in elementary school. And so there were these, you know, I do remember these anxious evenings where I'm trying to learn English, to read and write and all that. And, you know, my mother was frustrated, I was frustrated. And so at some point, she would just kind of close the notebooks and push them aside. And then she would start telling me stories about, back home, back on the reservation. And then that would be in Maliseet. And then she would start drawing pictures. And I remember one story about a cabin, and there was a canoe out in the lake, and then there were these hills, and there was like a moon coming up over from between the hills. And I just remember that so vividly. And that's what sparked my interest in, art. And so I thought, wow, I want to be able to draw just like Mom.
And I remember when I was little that my father used to put me to sleep by making up stories. And he's kind of has a poetic streak, and just the kind of worlds he created with the words fed me, made me feel good.
Well, when I was young, my mother said that I was never happy unless I had paper and pencil around me, and I was always drawing and creating something. So I think I probably got it from my father, who was very creative. He was worked as a sort of an engineer in the East African railways, and he actually modeled a train, and he was also a musician, because he could play the violin, and he couldn't read a word of music, but he could pick up the violin and just play anything.
My grandmother, she had such a great influence in my life. We, a lot of First Nations, were multi-generational in our homes. So our house was always packed, to the point where I always felt like I didn't want kids because there's always so many people in our house. And now I have 2 kids of my own. And she would love to draw, and we draw and color together when I was a little girl. And my mom saw the spark of how much I could just sit and draw all the time. And it was actually in elementary school. They had these lunchtime activities that you could sign up for. And my mom had signed me up for different art series for drawing, pastel, painting, just to get a feel of it. And I took it all throughout high school. But my grandmother always encouraged me and had shared things that she liked. She loved the frogs and hummingbirds and eagles, and she would show me how she would draw it, and then she would allow me to give the time of how would I do it too.
Some sources are beyond our immediate family.
When I was doing the elder interviews for that, I was asking the elders, have you seen these tree carvings? And then all they wanted to talk about was climate change and their worry about water. And I had a thesis to write, and I was like, okay, but yeah, let's get back to these tree carvings. Oh, no, we want to talk to you about water. And so that was the first time I was like, wow, there's a big topic here too, but I don't have time to pursue it right now. So I wrote a bit about it in my book, but then after I finished that book, I decided I'm going to intellectually follow this path that the elders had laid out. So I started researching water on my own, after work or whatever. I always did this stuff independently because I realized the universities, if I work with them, they would kind of push me in a different direction, and I knew that I had to pursue this direction the elders are talking about, so I just had to do it on my own.
Even from a stranger.
There are people I've met for 15 minutes. There was a black woman I visited in New York City who was poverty-stricken, and I was part of the anti-poverty program, and I saw her for a short time, only once, and her spirit, she never complained, she protected herself, she was tough, but far-sighted, and goodwill, in spite of everything, goodwill. And I still remember her. So I don't know what has happened to her, but she's a part of who I am. So we affect each other in ways we don't know.
Sometimes from ordinary, everyday objects.
Every day I find something new I can do I get inspired by something else. And I love the pencil crayon. People don't think of a pencil crayon being a good source of creativity. And of course I found out about I saw these puzzles at one of the art stores here. And I thought, that's what I'm going to do. So I started to do that. And you can just create your thing on there. And then I turn it over and do it on the other side. And once I start something, it doesn't matter what I start. I can't do one. I have to do 20 or 30 of them. I keep going. And it's just like socks. I've started knitting these socks. And I've got socks. I did the boxes, and then I did gifts. I call them socks in a box. Now it's puzzle in a box, and all kinds of things in those boxes. So the boxes created another. I got inspired by that, and I thought, well, what else can I do in the box? I'm going to do a box where everybody can write a little something on a piece of paper, and you slip it in there. And then sometimes you can take it out and start looking at it to say, like a little diary, if you know what I mean. That would be really nice, or a little story. When I make a box, the last part of the box of putting one on top of the other makes me feel, wow.
And Mother Ocean looking out for us in the most basic and profound way.
Nature has a lot to teach us. Growing up, nature was something that I loved, and it was something that I explored. But now I see nature very much as a teacher and a guide. And for example, living on the sailboat, as I do currently here on Coast Salish waters, just really been learning about the ocean and living in such close proximity to the ocean, and how that's cultivated such a deep, deep respect. And a respect for the ocean in all of its ways of being. So it's become not just on happy, calm days when you're just kind of motoring along, but also in the storms, and there's a sense of response to the ocean rather than, or I should say, it jars us very quickly out of this sense that we control nature, that we have any control over the ocean whatsoever. When you're in the middle of the Georgia Strait and the winds are howling at 30 knots, you are very aware of how little you control and how powerful the ocean and the winds and just how it all works together in this really beautiful way. The tide and the moon and just the connectivity of all of it. It's almost impossible to miss.
It always begins with love and ends with love. Abundant attention to the quality of others' stories help us co-create our own stories we can share with the world. Many of us begin to learn the power of our own memory and imagination, and even adversity. We understand that a moment of harmony with all life is at the very core of collective flourishing. We are our stories.
It's really what I call kitchen Swahili, because we were raised with the Africans. I can teach you a song in Swahili. You know that song, Yes, We Have No Bananas? Are you ready? Ndio hakuna indisi, hakuna indisi leo. Yes, we have no bananas. We have no bananas today. That's my Swahili song.
One of the musical gatherings in Seattle has a songwriting competition. And this year their theme was storms. So here's what I'm going to sing. But if I can. When stuck on shore, I long to be sailing free on the open sea. But storms and gales, they do remind me, at sea you're not always welcome. Let's have another drink, I could stand one more. Drink to our health, still safe on shore. Weather warnings we may ignore, 'cause the sea's the source of our income. The sea's the source of our income. I think there is something important about not being too self-conscious, not being too worried about doing what everyone else is doing. You know, having the confidence to do something that feels right to you because of your interests or your background, or so it can be very personal.
You can express yourself in different ways. You can doing, you know, some of the moves you can make up is the painter, right? This could be a dance move. This could be a dance. Just go to the music. I don't know. Just make up a move. Put yourself out there. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about anybody else. Don't care about what anybody else thinks. Just have fun with your own body. This is called the Carlton.
Oh no, that is the Carlton. That is the actual Carlton. Yeah. This thing is, by the way, this thing is, by the way.
I get to know their aspirations. I get to see light bulbs turning on as new ideas come to them. I love doing student advising, seeing where students alleviating someone's anxiety. There is no greater joy in the world than that. Hey, you can make it to the end of this program. Oh, this is great for you. Hey, you are talented. Look at that. Look at what you did. And right now it is so needed for people to have their anxieties alleviated. I want to be kind to the people that I'm in a relationship with. I want to bring art and beauty to the world. And I want to make people think. I don't really care too much the content of what they think, but I just want to inspire people to think. Because I don't think we're going places unless people are thinking. And I trust people enough. They will have good thoughts if they're truly thinking. Yeah, I'm so privileged. I get to make art. Yes. I get to talk to students. I have absolutely nothing to complain about on this planet.
I get most excited about group projects. Mm-hmm. So in school, I was really frustrated by them, as everybody was, I think. But now I really prefer to do work in a collective setting with other people, and so I get most excited about the work that happens in those spaces. I'm part of a student collective that is working with people who are formerly incarcerated, working to promote kind of prison abolition. It's really powerful. I am just constantly learning a lot every day, and really grateful for those opportunities. Yeah, just me by myself in the corner. I think I would just, I don't know, maybe create a weird picture on the wall, but it wouldn't go very far. But when you come together with other people, there's such a beautiful wealth of ideas and inspiration, and challenging one another, and really kind of sharpening each other in a really good way. Yeah, I think I've been most surprised by that kind of movement in my life.
And so world making is about that aspect of, well, this is the world I live in. It existed before I existed, but now how do I imagine the world moving forward? And so for me, this goes back to the stories. We all love stories. And so some of the stories are, these kind of collaborative processes of world making. Even if somebody's reading a story to you, it's still that aspect of a participatory story event. And in that story event, your brain, together with others, is creating that new world. And so today, after this conversation, the world's going to look different to you. We've already transformed the world in meaningful ways. And so for me, world making is about doing just that. I have a tendency not to, towards the end of the essay, these academics, you got to write a conclusion. Okay, so it's, 2 paragraphs, 3 paragraphs, depending on what you're doing, and you have to say conclusion. And so I don't do that. And I say, in the beginning. And so the idea is that it doesn't stop here. And so for me, the conversations have to go on. We don't just, say, put a period at the end and it's done. And so there are no last words here. And so for me, I think, again, it's about that kind of world making, that now that we've had this conversation, you'll have other conversations, and it's going to carry on. And so that's what I'm excited about.
Stories come in a variety of forms beyond language, like movement or a wrinkled face. The form or medium is not as important as the act of creation. So many of us are forever indebted to our grandmothers who were by our side and sang soft lullabies to us. The warmth of her body or the gentle stroke of her hands is itself a means of communication, and the spirit itself. What makes everything beautiful are those relationships and connections. Now, it is up to us to recognize and be the spirit and be the whole, like water. Whether deep in the mantle or up in the sky, we are connected.
And so it's like that quote from the Broadway musical Carousel, in which it is stated, as long as one person remembers me, it was worth it.
Do you have a message for your great-grandchild? What would you like to tell them?
I'm trying to think of a quote from Zorba the Greek. Let me teach you to dance. Yeah. Go with the flow. Be open to experiences that are just unimaginable. Because they're actually there for the taking.
Noticing one dewdrop sliding off a blade of grass is a moment of unity and transcendence. The world of dew. A world of dew it is indeed.
Piangi con me, è che ora non c'è più nessun angelo di vetro fra me e te. E tu piangi con me, è che ora non ho più nessun altro motivo per andare via da te, da te. forse la mia vita è come un angelo di vetro che si frantumerà. O forse la mia vita è come un diavolo di sabbia che si disperderà. Di sabbia che si disperderà. Piangi con me, che ora non c'è più nessun angelo di vetro fra me e te, fra me e te, fra me e te. O forse la mia vita è come un angelo di vetro che si frantumerà. Forse la mia vita è come un diavolo di sabbia che si disperderà. Di sabbia che si disperderà. Forse la mia vita è come un angelo di vetro che si frantumerà. O forse la mia vita è come un diavolo di sabbia che si disperderà. Di sabbia che si disperderà.